I'm Dr. David Bernstein, and welcome to the very last video in our series, 25 Tips for Working with Modes. Now, last time we talked about how you can reframe the patient's problems in terms of a voyage. And of course, one of the most important things on that voyage is, helping the patient to get his emotional needs met. And that brings us to the topic of today's video, find the wind. Now, so far in this series, we've emphasized modes and strengths, but where do needs come into play? And for that matter, what are needs? Well, one of the ways that you can think of emotional needs as being motivations for our behavior. So if you think about fundamental needs like attachment and autonomy, attachment motivates us to form close relationships with other people. And, our autonomy needs motivate us to, become independent and self-sufficient. And so then how can we think about, what strengths are, in relation to needs? Well, we can think of our strengths as being the positive qualities that we have that enable us to get our needs met. And so what that means is that, in helping patients to get their needs met, one of the advantages of working with strengths is that as you, shine a light on their strengths and they start to become more aware of their strengths, they can start to use their strengths in the service of getting their needs met more adequately. Okay, now what does this process look like in practice? Well, let's take, the example from last time, the case of Ruth, and talk about, how you can combine strengths and needs in order to help your patient. Well, one of the metaphor I like to use for emotional needs and getting emotional needs met is the wind in our sails. Because, when you're getting your emotional needs met, then it kind of feels like, you're sailing through the water, your sails are full of wind, you have lots of energy, and you have all the energy you need to accomplish what you want to in life. And when our patients come to us, in therapy, the situation is often the opposite of that. And that's illustrated by, the image here, which you can see, the poor sailor sitting there, with the sails draped down, lacking in wind. And, this is a situation, that is called in English, the doldrums. And I don't know if you've heard of this term or not, but the doldrums is a term in English that means, a state of a lack of energy or depression. But the doldrums actually refers to a place, a real physical place. It's in the Atlantic Ocean, and it's near the equator. And it's a place of high humidity where, oftentimes for long periods of time, there's very little or no wind. And, in the olden days of, masted sailing ships, these ships would sometimes get stuck in the doldrums for weeks or months. So they would be literally, they'd be stuck in the doldrums and, with no wind in their sails. And you can imagine under the hot sun and with high humidity, how hard that was on those sailors. And that's often how it feels for our patients. Now, the way I think about it is that, that's because they're not getting their emotional needs met. And if you think about, the case of Ruth, that was certainly true. She was feeling, really frustrated and helpless in her life, that she had this terrible, sense of being alone, really without feeling that she didn't have the connections that she really needed or wanted. And also felt that, she really couldn't assert herself, especially when it came to her children. So it's not surprising that, she felt stuck in the doldrums. So, what do you do when your patient is stuck in the doldrums? Well, what you need to do is start to orient them toward getting their needs met. And the metaphor, that I like to use for that, is starting to tack into the wind, right? So, on a sailboat, what you need to do is start maneuvering the sails in order to catch the wind, in order to move forward. And, for our patients, learning to tack into the wind usually involves, a series of small experiments, trying different things and seeing what works. Now, for many of them, it's really a kind of new experience. Many of them have had very little experience in getting their needs met. Maybe because of their childhood experiences, they didn't get their needs met very often. And for some of them, if they've experienced rather deep emotional deprivation, they may even inside feel that they don't deserve to get their needs met, or that nobody would ever be interested in meeting their needs. So this can be a new and sometimes anxiety-provoking experience for patients. But nevertheless, once they start to experiment in getting their needs met, they can start to feel a little bit of that feeling of having the wind in their sails. And how do we help them to do that? By using their strengths. So for example, I mentioned last time that that Ruth was somebody who was actually a very warm and caring person. But because of her depression, she had isolated herself. She hadn't told her friends, for example, that she was depressed. So, what she needed to do was, use those, interpersonal strengths that she had in the service of her needs. And her need was the need for attachment. So what did she do? She started making some regular appointments to get together with her friends. And that helped a little bit. It helped her feel a little bit better. And, furthermore, eventually she got up the courage to start dating again. And that's something she hadn't done in a number of years, since her divorce. And again, not all of those experiences with dating were successful. And yet, again, slowly, by experimenting and tacking, she started to get a little bit more wind in her sails. She became a little bit less depressed and started to experience more energy. Okay, but then, how further? Because, what we would really like to do is help our patients to create islands of strength, places that they can go to on a regular basis to practice getting their needs met by using their strengths. And so, in the case, again, if you think about, bringing a strength into play in the service of getting one's needs met, one way to do this that's very practical, is together with the patient to create a kind of project, where they think about, what is a central need they would like to meet? And then what is one of their strengths that they can use on a regular basis to try to help them get that need met? Now for Ruth, the main thing that was missing in her life was obviously attachment, right? Underneath she was feeling, she'd been feeling abandoned. She was feeling quite lonely. She had lacked connections from her, with her adult children. And so clearly the issue for her was attachment. That was the need that she really wanted to fulfill. But which strength could she use? Well, okay, she was using some of her social strengths, and that was helping to a degree. But there was another area of strength that Ruth had. It's a very important one to her. And, that had to do with, her spirituality. Ruth was somebody who, kind of had a feeling that, life had a larger purpose. And she had grown up in a particular, religious tradition that was very important to her. And if you took a look at Ruth's strengths, if you think about, way back to our, video about the strengths profile, one area of strengths are what we call transcendence strengths. They're the kinds of strengths that have to do with finding meaning and purpose in life. And one of Ruth's strengths was wisdom. Now she was in, at the time, I met with her, she was already in her, late 40s, and she'd had a lot of life experience. And part of that life experience had been, joyful things, but some of it had been suffering. And in her family history, there had been a lot of suffering too. But sometimes, in that suffering, people can also find important life lessons, lessons about, what's truly important in life. And, that was true for Ruth. And so as she started to think about how she could get her attachment needs met, and using her strength of wisdom, she began to think about, what kind of spiritual religious community would she like to be a part of? She had for a very long time been a part of a congregation where she really felt like an outsider. She felt that it was a place that was too concerned with status, where people did a lot of showing off, and she didn't really feel like she had a lot to show off compared to some of these people. And she had kind of clung to that congregation for a long time because that's what was familiar to her, but it really wasn't meeting her spiritual needs, and it certainly wasn't meeting her attachment needs. So what did she do? She began to look for another congregation. So here she was, using her transcendence needs, and particularly the need of wisdom, realizing that for her, connecting with her, spiritual traditions in a meaningful way was very important to her. And that was part, again, of her learning how to tack into the wind. And she visited a number of different congregations until she found one that she really liked, one that really felt warm and welcoming, and where the people weren't there to show off their status. They were really there to connect deeply with their spirituality. And once, Ruth had found this place, this became the basis for an island of strength that she had created. And she very frequently would go to services there that would leave her, feeling much more hopeful, much more connected. And she also met people there. She met like-minded people like her, and formed some really, really nice connections there. And so, in terms of building an island of strength, this became a place that Ruth could go to regularly. It was kind of, if you could say, structurally embedded into her life. And that made an enormous difference to her in terms of how she felt. She felt much more energy, much more buoyancy, much more power in order to move ahead in her life. So again, this process involved, starting with her relationship strengths, her connection strengths, starting to tack into the wind to get her attachment needs met, and then, using that, strength of wisdom and spirituality in order to really form deep and meaningful connections that she had been missing for a long time. Okay. Now, I'd like to end this video by talking about, just how important it is to have that feeling of the wind in your sails. And I think when our patients experience that, it makes a world of difference to them. So, I wish you good luck in terms of, helping your patients on that voyage. It can be a long process, but I think it's really important that we have, faith and hope, for our patients, and that we convey that to them, that we believe in them, and that through this process, that they can end up feeling much more of that sense of energy and buoyancy in their lives. And I'd also like to thank you for watching this series, and I hope that you've gotten something out of it that can help you in your own practice. So, thank you very much for, going on this, voyage with me. And finally, if you haven't done so already, I'd like to invite you to come to our website, www.imodes.com, and take a look at our image-based therapy tools. Now, I've really enjoyed doing this series. I hope you have too. And I am planning another series. I'm not going to tell you what that is now, but we'll be announcing it, sometime early next year. Okay, so, hopefully I will see you sometime soon, and enjoy the holidays, and, good luck in your work with your patients.